Remember that? That's a public school teacher. Now, I'm not hating the player, but I do hate the game. And so does James Davis. He's who we'll be interviewing today for another Neema V Freedom Fiends solo joint. James went to college in the hopes of being a teacher, but soon became disillusioned with the system. He chunked the deuce and then spent some years as a professional poker player, making bank until the government cracked down on that too. Now he's calling the government's bluff when it comes to kids. He runs libertychildren.com and advocates for changing the way we think about education. He also runs a camp for kids where theory gets turned into practice. Today he'll be educating us, so take a listen and find out why I say James is on the front line in the long war against the state. All right, Freedom Fiends, it's Neema Vedadi. I'm here with James Davis. How you doing today, James?
I'm doing great, Neema. Thanks for having me on.
All right. And now you do a lot of work as far as teaching kids about liberty and promoting the cause of teaching kids liberty in the idea that's sort of where liberty starts, is with children. So tell us a little bit about the work that you do to, as you say, help children flourish with freedom.
Oh, sure. Essentially, my wife and I, and actually my younger brother too, are all, kind of lovers of liberty, so to speak. And, when we had our kid a couple of years ago, we realized that there was no really good, first of all, liberty information really out there in a consolidated way. We were able to draw from all sorts of different, sort of ideologies, I guess, but none of them were specific in their targeting for people who, want to strip down this notion that some people have to be in charge and boss other people around, and that some people are those who are, bossed around. Mm-hmm. And, so we were able to pull from all sorts of different sources. But, when we try to communicate these ideas to other people, we realize, it might be just more effective to put it up on a website. So we did that. And, in kind of my day-to-day life, I'm a director of a summer camp where I try to, employ the ideas of liberty as often as possible, while also understanding that a lot of my clients might not be as far along the liberty spectrum as I am.
I see. So this camp, is it a lot? Most of your customers are people who are liberty lovers, or is it just a normal camp that you go and then, you just eschew any kind of force when it comes to running the camp?
Yeah, so I would say, almost none of my clients come in as liberty-loving people. And it's an interesting thing, because basically they all like the ideas when they're stated one by one, especially in regards to how you treat kids. So, they all sort of love the idea that we're going to show their kids respect and show their kids love and strip away rules that are designed for adult convenience and, not do any sort of horrible things to their kids that we wouldn't accept in our adult day-to-day interactions. And so they love all those sorts of ideas. And so I don't typically get into the extrapolation of those ideas very often at all, certainly not with the parents. And then the people that hear more of it are more my counselors that work for me, and then my leaders in training. And not so much that I try to espouse dogma to them, but I just mostly pose questions to them, like, is taxation fair, stuff like that, or is it moral? And then we just have discussions based on there. And, I find it to be very well received. I thought more people would be sort of disgruntled with just how radical our approach is, especially in giving kids freedom. But no, mostly people seem pretty excited about it.
Excellent. Okay. Now, I think forcing kids into a school and basically treating them like slaves until they're 18 is immoral. And that's really all the reason I need to oppose government schooling. But from what I've heard, you've actually done some research and looked into this a little bit more deeply. Why don't you tell us why the way we traditionally school kids now and for the past, 100 or so years is not just immoral, but it's also very damaging to the kids?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the craziest things, because essentially I think you can start from the moral principle, like what you're talking about. But then the pragmatists of the world always want to chime in and say, well, like you're thinking, well, what about the roads, And in education, we have those things too. How will kids learn to read? How will they learn their math? And so on. And first of all, I'd like to say in the positive direction, we have no evidence at all that a child who's not forced to learn things will just refuse to learn. And in fact, all of our evidence is to the contrary. John Holt, who is a big educational theorist in the 60s and 70s, he observed many studies where kids given no incentive to read, no prizes, nothing at all, and no instruction, these children actually, I can't remember the name of the school now, but basically they went forward in this school for their full schooling time, and over the course of 18 years or whatever, they all knew how to read pretty much, and all of them learned on a median time of about 40 hours total of instruction. So basically, at some point, they decided, I can't quite get to the level I need to. Reading-wise, I better seek out an adult. So they go to an adult. The adult sort of unlocks a few key ideas, and the kid learns to read. And, in some of these cases, the kids are learning in 10 hours or less. and
10 hours or 40 hours, much less than, the years that some kids take in a public school. Or, often we hear this in the media about how kids can be, later on in school and still not reading appropriately.
Oh, no doubt. When I was student teaching, there was a girl who was in my class with no IEP, which is an individualized education program. She couldn't, she spelled school like SKOOL and stuff, and she couldn't communicate any ideas in a written way, and no one had even noticed. So, and this is in like a fine school, this wasn't in Detroit or any of the sort of horror places that you talk about. And so kids just slip through the cracks constantly, and, that's kind of a more modern function of No Child Left Behind. But, beyond the fact that kids will learn no matter what, there's very real evidence that forcing them to learn stuff just damages them. Kind of the two classic examples, I would say, are first a study that was done, I think it's called Breaking Points and Beyond, where they took these very young children and they tested them for what they call divergent thinking. So that's the ability to look at a problem and find more than one solution.
Okay.
And they took 1,500 kids, and they were kindergartners, and they tested them for their abilities in divergent level thinking. And, they ranked them on the spectrum of, kind of beginner abilities or decent or average to good, and then genius level. So, like a genius in physics would be Albert Einstein. So like that sort of competency. And they found that these kids heading on their first day of school for kindergarten were ranked as 98% geniuses at divergent thinking.
Without going to school yet. This is
without ever setting foot in any school at all. And so basically they were being posed with questions like, what are some uses for a paperclip, and just coming up with dozens times more answers than their adult counterparts. And so they ran this in a longitudinal study, and which basically means they checked in with the kids again, 5 years later, 10 years later, and so on. And they just found precipitous decline. From 5 years later, it was down to like 40%, and 10 years later, it was down to maybe 10. I don't know off the numbers off the top of my head. And then by the time they were graduating high school, they had just totally regressed to the mean, and there were an average number, like 2% of them were these geniuses in divergent thinking. And so you could picture an education system being designed to make people better at something, right? and not worse.
Now, why do you think that is? Is that because obviously when you're at school, there's one right answer. Or maybe the teacher will give you partial credit if you almost said exactly what they wanted you to say. Is that sort of what causes this decline in the divergent thinking?
No doubt. Well, it's two things. What you talked about, the one right answer is a huge problem, but then there's also the one right process, where like the basic thing would be math teachers saying, show your work. I don't care how you figure out something, you need to figure it out the way I tell you to. And that's a huge problem, because the teacher, I think, and it's oftentimes well-intentioned, they think, the easiest way to solve multiplication is by putting the two numbers on top of each other or whatever. But the lesson learned there is when you want to solve problems, find someone who's an authority and ask them how you solve problems. And I think that's where most of it goes. The other one that I think is really crazy is particularly, well, I have a couple. I just thought of a recent one the other day in talking to a little kid, but I'll start with the one which is a physical manifestation in their brain. I think this is from John Medina's book, Brain Rules for Baby, where he talks about when we force kids to try to learn concepts that their brain isn't quite ready for. The example he uses is multiplication tables, that actually you're forcing them to use a lower brain function to do a higher brain process. So, in order to multiply two things together, you basically, an adult would picture, okay, I have 5 balls, and if I had 5 groups of 5 balls, they sort of picture 25 balls. And then they can also subsequently say, oh, well, if I had only 4 groups, it would be 20. But when you force a child who's unable to conceptualize that because their brain isn't physically developed to do it, they'll use memorization. And memorization is one of the most basic brain functions. And so what the brain does is it actually forms physical connections, demonstrable physical connections that say, okay, when faced with a multiplication sort of problem, use this tool, memorization. And so it disallows their brain, or at least inhibits it from then going and performing that function when presented with a new thing. They'll be fine in terms of recall, but when, say, the things you're supposed to learn from multiplication, problem solving, when you're supposed to do that, then they try to recall in memorization, and it's like a huge hurdle to climb when trying to rebuild your brain's ability to perform those functions.
And now, force in schools, it's not just on the kids, but on the teachers as well. My mom was actually a public school teacher for years. She eventually retired because, district-wide, they started this new program, this new curriculum, and it just wasn't working. And my mom had done some research on it, and she realized that this had a high failure rate for kids. It wasn't giving the kids what they really needed. I think it was called Discovery Math or something to that effect.
Right, okay.
And basically, she wasn't allowed to teach the kids math problems, but they had to play with blocks and things like that. And maybe it worked for a few kids, but some kids wanted to learn the old way. And she actually had kids coming up to her and saying, can you teach me the math we used to learn? And she wasn't allowed to. If she tried, she would get in trouble. And there were actually district monitors that would walk around and monitor and make sure the teachers were doing things the approved method. How much are teachers' hands tied these days when it comes to school? I know that you yourself were going to college to be a teacher. Is that correct? And you saw this firsthand as well.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is what I call like the psychosis of the central planner, like that some district bureaucrat who might never even meet a child can somehow determine what's exactly right for that child to learn on a day-to-day basis. I mean, certainly it was there in the public school when I was learning and a student teacher. And then my wife actually taught in a private school for a handful of years. And she got so micromanaged to the point where her math curriculum on a day-to-day basis, it was beginning to end essentially scripted. And she had a little bit of wiggle room. And it was actually something that sprung from that. We watched this Ken Robinson video called Changing Educational Paradigms that basically showed her, that you just can't centrally plan how every single kid is going to learn. And it's just really nuts. And yeah, so teachers' hands are totally tied. And I really think that's why so many teachers, probably like your mom, become disillusioned. And, they head in to teaching all full of vim and vigor, like I'm going to change the world. And then they're turned into a robot within 5 years. And then that's a pretty miserable existence compared with, using your own brain and your own creativity on a day-to-day basis.
Where I live right now, there's this big push. The schools are trying to get their annual levy, their money that they use to buy stuff. And so everybody has these signs up all around town, vote yes for schools, vote yes for our children, all this kind of stuff. And when I was working as a TV reporter, I'd have to do a lot of education stories, and the system was never questioned. It was always a question of more money. What do you think it is that has the majority of the populace sort of getting it wrong on this? They sort of want to throw more money at the problem, or make a few tweaks, or have more accountability for teachers. Why do all of the fixes that people seem to come up with not address the real problem?
Well, I think it starts with the fact that that's how government solves all its problems, unlike a basic private business. So, at my camp, if we're having a problem, for instance, if kids left our camp and parents were saying, hey, this camp doesn't build confidence, my kid didn't leave feeling better about himself with more friends, we wouldn't tell them, well, you need to give us more money. How are we supposed to do this without more money? But that's the government.
Let's raise our prices
model.
And then you'll get better service.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But that's the government business model, which is to say, hey, we can't seem to run a post office efficiently. Give us more money. We can't run a school without even more money. So, they keep raising the taxes and the fees, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. All the studies point to the fact that we're slipping educationally, and I think it's probably because we do get more money. It becomes more structured and more micromanaged and more tested and more regulated. And, the bigger the regulation gets, the more creativity is stripped away from the people actually in the trenches teaching, and we see the results.
Do you think it's also a result that most of these parents and the administrators and the school teachers are a product of the schools themselves? So they've learned that this model is what works, or they've learned that this model is the model to use.
No doubt, yeah.
So they can't get that divergent thinking going, I guess, because it's been stripped from them to figure out another solution to educate the children.
Well, right, and they're the equivalent of like the 95-year-old smoker who's been, smoking his whole life and then has therefore determined that cigarettes can't possibly cause cancer because he doesn't have cancer. Like, just because you survived. And I think this is kind of the perverse thing about the system in general, which is that it creates people kind of like I was forever, which is, after I got out of college, I was instantly pretty successful making money and stuff. And so since I was fine, I didn't really worry about how bad off everyone else was. And, as one of the people who is fine, I was probably, given both genetic gifts and experiences that led me to being somewhat monetarily successful. And even though I was one of the people who could probably enact change, I was complacent. Whereas the people who are not complacent are just so damn busy that they can't get around. They're just working nonstop, so they don't have time to go out and change anything. So it's just a win-win-win all around for the government, which is a really sad thing for me.
Right, because it's a lose-lose-lose for everybody else.
Oh, no doubt, yeah.
In a lot of libertarian circles, people point out all the time, how bad government schools are, what's wrong with them, and all that. But on your website, you bring up an important distinction between negative and positive directives. Basically, if you tell a kid, don't run, he'll skip or jog or sprint. And this was one of my favorite things to do as a kid. Whenever an authority figure told me something not to do, I would try my best to pick the closest thing to it and start doing that immediately, just to spite them. You say the much better approach is the positive directive. So instead of don't run, you would say, walk, please.
Right.
So what is the walk, please? What's the positive directive for people who want their kids to have a good life, to learn things, and to grow in a positive manner? It's not just don't go to government schools, don't send them to public school. What is the positive thing they should be doing?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and definitely the question that we're trying to answer at libertychildren.com there. I think that it starts with really assessing what your priorities in life are. So like for us, we were in a cushy middle-class situation. We owned our house and that sort of thing. But we realized that with our payments, we weren't going to be able to, for instance, homeschool our kids and unschool them since we both needed to work. And so for us, it would have been very easy to say, well, we can't afford to do this. So we'll just send them off to maybe a private school or public school or whatever. But, for us, it was so important that we needed to get out of it. So we sold our house, came to this camp where my wife could stay home and unschool our children. So the first thing I would say is you really need to just figure out, is this a priority of yours? I don't blame people for whom this is actually impossible. Like if you're working 3 jobs, then you need to send your kids to government schools because, you're already paying for them. I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to do. But for those people who are fed up and willing to make a change, I think that there are a ton of really great steps you can take. I'd say the first thing starts with being just intentional about how you interact with children in general. And what I mean by that is, we all have these habits that we've built up largely based on how we were treated as kids. And even if we sort of have a sense that something is wrong, especially with the government or the way culture is today, we rarely think critically about how we're interacting with kids, mostly because they're pushovers, We're just able to boss them around because we're pretty impressive and big and all that sort of stuff. But I would say, first look through the lens of, if an adult were treating me this way, how would I feel? And if the answer to that is, I would feel horrible, then just don't do it to a kid. So like the sort of canned examples I have are, like for instance, Neema, if you came up to me and said, hey, James, I got this great story, man. I'm so excited. And I said, whoa, slow down, buddy. Use an inside voice. Like you would think I was psychotic, right? Like you would be like, you would never want to talk to me again. You would. I
would laugh my ass off and think it was sarcasm. But yeah, if you were serious, right. I would, take offense to that.
Right. And you would probably tell all your friends, like I would be headlining Freedom Fiends as a psycho.
Right. Can you believe this James guy? Oh my God.
Yeah, but we do that with kids all the time. We just think that because they're born like a handful of years after us, that they're less of a person than us. And there's many, many examples of rules like that. And so I'd say first, kind of give back your own privilege. And this is the hardest thing to do in any hierarchical structure, which is like the government never gets smaller because it sucks to give up power. And with kids, I think you have to start by doing that, like not rushing kids. That's a big one. similarly, if you and I were going out for pizza and I was screaming at you, hey, we were supposed to leave 10 minutes ago. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to get out of your room and get down here. Like, once again, it's just not acceptable. So I think recasting things, it's kind of the non-aggression principle, right?
Right.
Just recasting things and using empathy and saying, if I were being treated this way, it would suck. So I'm not going to do that to anyone else. And that's kind of the broad approach, the principled idea. And then the only time you can ever use force, in my mind, when you're interacting with a child is when that child is in imminent physical danger. So like running out in front of a moving bus, I think you can grab a child and pull them back and use your force for good. But I think where I draw the line is I need to guarantee that 20 years from now, that kid is going to look back and say, hey, thanks for doing that. Thanks for encouraging me to brush my teeth or, not run into oncoming traffic or whatever else. And that's kind of an idea actually I got from Stefan Molyneux in his, I think it's called Peaceful Parenting videos on YouTube.
Okay. But of course that wouldn't be aggression to do something like grab your kid, and pull him off the railroad track so he doesn't get hit by a train. You're not aggressing against him. So that would still fall in line with the non-aggression principle.
Oh, exactly.
You're listening to the Freedom Fiends podcast. Freedom Fiends is now available for 24/7 streaming to your iPhone, Android phone, or other Chromed robot turd. Click on the streaming audio link on freedomfiends.com. That's FreedomFeens.com.
So, James, tell me a little bit more about some other alternatives people can have to public schools as far as educating their kids. You mentioned unschooling. Go ahead and tell us what that is.
Sure. Unschooling is, I think it's a movement that John Holt gets credited for starting. Basically, it's just a child-led education model that's usually done at home, where basically the child gets to spend his or her time how he or she sees fit. So, the day starts when the child wants to wake up. It doesn't get woken up and get a horrible association with waking up like most of the adult world has. It decides, what subjects it wants to pursue or not. It can choose academic pursuits or just kind of fun pursuits or whatever else. There kind of are two fields. There's one that's what's called radical unschooling, which means, if your kid plays video games all day, every day, you don't even say anything to them like, hey, maybe we should go outside. I don't really subscribe to that as much as I do kind of what we call creating a nutrient-rich environment. So having sort of either academics or creative pursuits available for the child if they're ever interested, and then providing sort of learning opportunities like, hey, do you want to go to the zoo or whatever else? But, if the child says no, by all means, no, and no pressuring allowed and that sort of stuff. And basically it just honors the child and their, outlook on the world. It doesn't tell them that, hey, math is more important, or when you grow up you need to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. And it's mostly an approach that stresses helping a person become happy as opposed to helping them become some sort of academic genius,
I see. What would you tell critics who say, oh, well, then kids won't learn anything and they'll grow up and they'll be working at McDonald's, and how will they compete in the real world and yada, yada?
Oh, sure. Well, I would point them in the direction of schools who actually run an unschooling model. Like, I think the oldest one is the Summerhill School in England. In the U.S., we have what are known as Sudbury schools, that they do a purely unschooling approach where there are no academic requirements on the kids at all. And all their evidence points to absolutely no problems with people learning how to read or learning math. I think I could pull this up here. The Sudbury schools boast, I think like more than 80% of their kids go to colleges. And in fact, the one that I work with from time to time, I think they do like over 90% pursue secondary education. So
more than a traditional high school.
Oh, no question at all. And, the type of thing, too, is like what's really important. Like, I agree that reading is an important skill to have in this day and age, but I think that people will be able to observe that for themselves. Like my son, who's 1.5, already wants to know what symbols mean and what letters are and that sort of thing. I don't need to force him to do that, just like I didn't need to force him to learn how to walk or talk. Like he saw that those were important and he wanted to learn how to do them.
Excellent. What do you think of... we're still working on this model of brick and mortar schools and things like that, but we have the internet now, and we have things like Khan Academy, which of course kids can can watch the videos, the lectures at their own pace. They can take the tests at their own pace. They can go back if they missed something. They don't have to, be tied to whatever the other 30 kids are doing or whatever the teacher wants them to do. How do you see that as growing as a movement and as something kids are doing? And how do you see it as an alternative to traditional schooling?
Oh, I think Khan Academy is amazing. I mean, I think, first of all, the fact that I think it's Salman Khan, he was able to say, what if we just turn the instruction model around, like learn your lessons at home and do your homework in school, was his kind of first thing. I think that's a really brilliant approach. I think that utilizing technology the schools have been totally lacking in that. But I think the biggest thing I love about Khan Academy is that is the assessment tools. It really empowers students to self-assess where they're going wrong, what they're learning easily. It helps their facilitators actually have real data on how things are progressing. And essentially no smart person who knows anything about statistics has ever tried to figure out school assessment before. Because the general theory is that it just can't be done. We can't figure out who knows what or whatever. And so anyway, I think it's a huge advancement. And I think it just speaks to what's possible when people are actually allowed to try to innovate in education. The saddest thing about education is that no one's really been allowed to try to innovate in the last 120 years or so.
Right, because it's such a politically charged thing. It's not, I have an idea, I'm going to do this in a school. It's, let's have a school board meeting and let's vote on what we should do. Or not even that, let's vote on who decides what we should do.
Oh, exactly.
And so you have everybody coming with their own political beliefs, and it becomes a game of politics rather than a game of let's do what's best for the kids.
Oh, exactly. Well, and everyone pays for it too, right? So, you can imagine what your food situation would look like if your 90% of your food budget was pre-spent every month. When I was in New Jersey, I was paying about $7,000 or $8,000 a year in property taxes that went directly to education, and already being behind the ball by $8,000, it was tough to come up with the additional $8,000 to educate my own child as well as someone else's, So innovation in that structure is really, really tough.
So we've talked about unschooling, Khan Academy, but what if, like you say, we've got two parents, they both have to work full time, they don't really have a whole lot of means, so they have to end up sending their kids to public schools. What are ways you can sort of prevent some of the pitfalls and the damage that public schools can have on kids while still sending them to public schools? What can you do as a parent to keep it from being so bad?
Yeah, that's a really important question to ask. And, I'm not sure I have a great answer just because there's 35 hours a week spent in those sort of indoctrination camps. The basic things I would say are to really encourage your children to stand up for themselves. Do not have any sort of authoritarian-based structure at home. Because one of the saddest things I think that comes is just that natural deference to authority. This deference has been linked to kids not reporting being abused, certainly not reporting teacher abuse, basically where they're using threats or, just even emotional or physical threats. I would say really not making them bow down, and then encourage them to be polite, kind of passive disobedience. But if a teacher says, hey, why aren't you doing your math? Just responding with that. It's not very important to me. I think that would be a really nice wake up call for a teacher. And then, in the parent teacher conference, don't apologize and sort of just tell the principal, tell anyone who will listen, I don't care if my kid gets a C or a D in your class if math isn't important to him. And that's a really tough thing to do. It takes, I guess, some bravery. But I would say the biggest thing is don't let your teachers tell you who your kid is. Don't let them encourage you to medicate your child if that's not where your intuition is. Don't take any of their advice if it's counter to your gut.
So basically you can teach your kids what's wrong with authoritarianism through the example of the school.
Yeah, right. Yeah, just tell them, observe what you don't like about school, and I would say to relate that to other uses of authoritarianism in the rest of society that we take for granted and encourage them to be critical thinkers. Because I think that kids can go through that model sort of, I guess the cliche matrix thing is, having taken the red pill, going in there and being aware of what's going on. It may make them miserable, which is the only downside. Like they might be really upset if they know that it's wrong and that, because kind of I think kids try to fit in because everyone's telling them that this is what it's supposed to be, even though it feels really wrong to them. I think they essentially just start practicing feeling that way, and eventually some of them are able to get used to it. But that's definitely not what I would want for my kid personally. I don't know.
Me either. A lot has also been said about how, this is sort of Stefan Molyneux's thing as well, is that the way you get to, a society without a state, or a society without force, or a society based on the non-aggression principle, is not just by tearing down the state or attacking the state, but it's about creating a society that realizes, hey, a state's not necessary. This is wrong. And only then will enough people be able to just withdraw their consent, and the state will just sort of collapse, and nothing will come in to fill that vacuum because there won't be people calling for, a new state. So obviously the most important thing then is educating children. How do you see this? Do you see this as a growing movement? Do you think that this is a workable strategy for libertarians to focus on educating their kids and then have their kids educate their kids? And is that sort of the slow play on taking down the state?
Yeah, nice poker analogy there. But yes, I think that's certainly what my approach is, because for me at this point in my life, I'm unwilling to go and get arrested and stuff like that. I just want to be able to be with my family. But I think that in the long term, really questioning legitimacy it's at least going to make people more accepting of the ideas of liberty at some point, And I think if you're constantly just pointing out, hey, look how ridiculous this is, that kids, well, because by the way, my experience with kids is that they already get it. Like even kids that are fully indoctrinated in schools, when they're still in the moment and still the oppressed, they totally get what you're talking about. Yeah. It's just as soon as they turn 22 or whatever, they get to be in charge that no one wants to give it back. It's like pledging a fraternity or something, The kids who hate pledging the most wind up being the worst hazers when they're seniors. And so my recommendation is that people do try to pursue this in some fashion, whether it's finding a Sudbury school, which I think are awesome, even though they're democratically run within the people in the school. So like kids and teachers all have one vote to determine school policy. It's not as bad as it sounds if you don't like democracy. Like there's no tyranny over what you pursue academically or creatively. And if you can't afford things like that, I really encourage people to do some sort of homeschooling or unschooling co-op, get together with your friends who are of a like mind, move to New Hampshire for the Free State Project or something. I know there are people up there doing it. Move to my house in New York, you can do it with me. And just get with people who agree, because it doesn't have to be that one person doesn't work at all. One thing that my wife and I are sort of planning for is for her eventually to be able to work maybe 3 days a week. And so maybe she's working 3 days and then I'm taking two of those days are my days off, so I can be doing it. And we find a couple other families in the area, and all of a sudden everyone can work full time, and we can still be educating our kids in the way we want. And I think it's totally doable. It's just a matter of if you want to make an excuse why it's too difficult, or if it's actually a priority for you.
Right. As behind the times as the state is and the government is, they have to catch on at some point that this is not good for them, having kids not go to their indoctrination centers. There are places that are doing things like giving the local police department the schedule of kids, their school schedule, so that the cops can keep track of the kids and know who's skipping class and not, and take them to jail if they do skip class. You're going to get some government jail, whether it's in school or in the actual jail. Do you worry that the state will increase their crackdown on this kind of thing, maybe even eventually make public schooling compulsory, or some type of government-approved schooling completely compulsory?
Well, I don't worry about that so much, just because we do have case law that's against it, so it'd be pretty tough to overturn. And it was actually considered, I think, what's called a fundamental human right. So would be really, really difficult for the Fed to do that. They certainly could, but I think it was a ruling in 1925. I don't remember. I think like the Pierce versus Society of someone or other, basically where they said a state can't prohibit a parent from satisfying compulsory attendance by sending their kid to a private school, and a private school can also be considered a homeschool situation. So I'm not really worried about that. But what I am worried about, like the truancy officers with kids' schedules, it's like the state's reading 1984 and getting ideas, Right. But basically, I am concerned about that, because I definitely have read a lot of stories about homeschooling parents, being alleged to not meeting certain requirements and even having their kids taken away from them. And so that I think is the bigger concern for me. The government kind of thinking that they can come in and essentially listen to my family's private conversations and decide whether it's appropriate for their education standards. That's definitely my doomsday scenario.
Right. And of course, things like Child Protective Services have a pretty horrible history of doing things like taking parents' kids away because they're not politically correct, not giving them the right medication if, the school decides the kid should be on Ritalin, things like that. Yeah. CPS can do things like step in, which is just a horrible situation. What can people do to avoid things like that, the government interfering in their family lives in ways other than the schools?
Well, that's a great question, too. It's actually something that Taylor, my wife, and I are trying to work on. One thing that we want to create, because one of the things that the homeschool policemen or whatever look for, they either make you take a test or provide portfolio of work. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're unschooling and your kid's portfolio of work is playing Call of Duty for the whole year, that's not going to be very impressive to them. So one thing I'd like to do is create, this is actually inspired by the recent Fed crackdown on mega upload. I'd like to create like a Dropbox site where unschooling and homeschooling parents can go and just submit work that their own kids have done, in a non-compulsory way, have it right on there. And then if you ever get the call, hey, we're coming to check your portfolio, you go onto this site and start downloading, drawings of fire trucks and all that stuff and be able to provide it. And I think that, we're certainly collecting all of our kids' stuff, and we'll be making it available for people to use online at some point. But I think the other thing to do is just look for support people online and in your area. I mean, the unschooling movement in New York is hugely underground. They have Yahoo groups and Facebook groups and stuff like that where they talk about strategies for subverting these things all the time. I mean, the people are out there that are getting away with it completely. I mean, getting away with it makes it sound like it's bad. They're observing their right to school their kids how they want. So you just have to look for people that are doing it and learn from them,
Since time began, tyrants have taken aim at personal liberties. Now there's a movie that aims back.
The government has no more right to tell us what to put in our bodies than they have to take our guns or tell us what books we can read.
6 drug police were eaten by bears while raiding a marijuana farm.
On your knees, you dirty hippies! Jesus. On your knees! What's the problem, officer?
Today, many cops who enforce pot laws do so only because it provides them with cushy jobs, good benefits, and a chance to push people around.
I was an undercover narcotics officer. The drug war is nothing but a farce.
The Second Amendment says you gotta keep you and your gat intact.
Guns and Weed, The Road to Freedom. A film by Michael W. Dean and Neema Vedadi.
DVD available now at gunsandweed.com or on Amazon. That's gunsandweed.com. Makes the perfect gift. Remember, that's gunsandweed.com.
What has really inspired you, other than having your kid, to sort of take this stance against the government using its force on children? Have you had any personal experience with that when you were growing up?
Well, yeah, I guess. When I was in school, I had a couple of pretty crazy things happen to me. I mean, one was I was rounded up by some police officers in 8th grade because they accused me of creating a virus to destroy all of the computer systems and all the grades in the system. So, essentially the reason this was happening was my so-called gifted and talented teacher had observed me making fake DOS prompts. So for the younger audience out there used to be this thing called DOS, which was like a text-based server, which where you'd find your files. And so I just made a little program that whenever you looked on there, it would say, hey, you don't have any files. I mean, all you had to do is type escape and you'd be out of it. But so she thought, man, this kid knows how to make viruses. So, she just accused me with no standing. And then they brought the police in, didn't tell my parents, scolded me and threatened me with all sorts of things, from never being able to touch a computer again to prison time. And
Did
I went home.
Did you tell your parents?
I went home and told my parents. Hell yeah. I was just scared. I thought they were going to be mad at me, but that was better than going to jail or something. So my dad is actually a computer programmer. for the Department of Energy. So he went in there and actually knows what he's talking about. He just didn't watch like Hackers or something, which was a movie at the time. And he said, first of all, you idiots, this is not how a virus works. My son can't write like thousands of lines of code to destroy all your systems. And second of all, you better call us if you have any concerns like this. And then the very next day, they brought me in and apologized. So that was kind of an eye-opener. I mean, I was always kind of countercultural, but it wasn't really until having our own kid and realizing that all my other pursuits in life, the things I actually knew stuff about, like, poker and economics and baseball, for instance, that mainstream culture is just wrong about. And then turns out, hey, they're wrong about education too. So who knew?
Right. And now, I don't have any kids yet, but I'm planning on it. What kind of advice do you have as far as interacting with your kids, other than obviously don't use force? But, in my recollection and in my experience, a lot of times kids and parents are sort of separate. The parents will do their thing. The kids will be in the other room playing Xbox or texting or tweeting.
Sure.
Should you as a parent make some sort of effort to interact with your kid as far as maybe showing them what you do, showing them your interests, sort of teaching you that kind of thing, treating them like a friend in that way? And is that very helpful to kids as far as education?
Oh, hell yeah. One of the things that I try to do when I became the director of this camp is just demonstrate enthusiasm for what kids are doing, just personally interacting with each kid. And with your kids, theoretically, you have even more time to do that. So even if it's not something that you totally like Xbox or, drawing. For instance, my son wants to draw 4 or 5 hours a day most days. And that gets a little tiring, drawing balls and books and stuff like that over and over. But demonstrating that enthusiasm makes him want to seek me out. Now, at some point, that's going to change. There's really awesome research done by a fellow named John Abbott about the adolescent brain and the fact that, it physically breaks itself down and will combat against what it's learned and what it's learned to imitate. But if you've established yourself as a credible and loving person, I think your kids will trust you. One of my big messages is that I don't want anyone to submit to me. I don't want anyone to fear me. I want them to think I'm awesome and think I'm credible and trustworthy. And if they do, they'll actually change what they do in their lives and not just kind of be afraid that I'm going to smack them if they misbehave in front of me.
Right. It's not a do it because I said so kind of thing. That's not going to get you the results we're looking for here.
Yeah, right. And it means, too, like making steps in your own life to model behavior that you like. Like, for instance, we got rid of a television in our house after, watching probably 4 hours of television a day, simply because, the research weighs in that it's not very good for the infant brain. And we certainly weren't going to watch television ourselves and tell our son that it wasn't all right for him to do, And I think that, once again, it's just whatever your priorities are. If that's not a priority of yours, then don't do it. But don't get mad at your kid then if he wants to watch television as long as you do.
Don't be a hypocrite, basically.
Oh yeah, right. But we just learned that hypocrisy is okay. I think you guys talked about on Freedom Fiends one time. We learned this thing that, there has to be a gun in the room. Someone's got to hold the gun. Who's got the gun? It's either me, or if it's not me, it's someone else, or the guy I voted for, or whatever. It's just teaching your kid that that's not a consistent worldview, that we're all equals. We're just people here. And if your child sees you as a person and you're fun, he'll want to hang out with you. And if you also have good advice that prevents him from getting hurt, he'll listen to that too,
Right. And now I feel like a lot of what we've been talking about is sort of kids at a younger age. At what point do you sort of give your kid complete autonomy? I guess you do from a very young age as well, as far as, not forcing them to do things. But at what point do you trust them as I guess, a full person. There's this state thing where, not until you're 18 are you, a full person. And then even after that, there's still some things that are forbidden. Until you're 21, you can't imbibe alcohol and things like that. What do we teach our kids, about, the government mandates that they're not, allowed to make legal decisions until they're 18? And I guess, how do we treat them when they're teenagers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's timely for me because just recently, I read a book by that guy, John Abbott, called Overschooled and Undereducated. And he's a British researcher and author on education. And his findings are phenomenal. Basically, to sum it up, he says that at some point in history, we decided that adolescents were just kind of annoying. They're 13 years old. They all of a sudden start rebelling against things. And that it wasn't because we wanted them to learn more stuff that we kept them in school longer at that point, but mostly because they were just getting in everyone's hair with their new ideas and questioning stuff. So his assertion is that kids were basically locked up, from 13 to 18. They originally blamed hormones and not realizing that what's actually going on in the brain, Abbott posits, is that every year about 0.75 to 1.5% of their synapses, these connections between their neurons, are physically breaking down every single year and reforming with new evidence. And, his evolutionary evidence points to the fact that this is actually one of probably the biggest things that's caused human beings to be able to survive. The glaciers coming down from the north, you have a bunch of people sitting around and saying, "Whoa, what's that glacier doing?" And then you have a group of 13 to 18-year-olds who say, "F you guys, we're leaving," and they leave, and then all those other people die. And then the next time, lions are invading the village, the people who are willing to say, "Maybe we should move," and they move, and everyone else says, "You're crazy. The lions have never caused any problems." And then they all get eaten. And so, he has archaeological evidence he cites and all sorts of studies that point to the fact that, being change-oriented, being dynamic and adaptable is the essential human quality. And so I'm definitely of a mind, after interacting with his research and actually talking to him personally through email, that adolescents definitely should be given the opportunity to explore things in a very free fashion. He advocates for the apprenticeship model, which is basically how human beings have done things for all throughout history until the last 200 years, which is to find someone who's successful at something, watch what they do, decide what they're doing well, decide what they're doing poorly, and then go do it yourself. And the cool thing about this day and age is you can always just change your mind. If you weren't satisfied as a carpenter when you were 25 1,000 years ago, that sucked. That was your only skill. But now, I've totally reworked my own knowledge base 10 times over since college. So, I definitely advocate for giving freedom to kids starting around that adolescence age.
Right. And then they can also teach us. So I imagine you'd also advocate listening to the kids when they tell us that, hey, something's wrong with society here. Something needs to change.
Oh, definitely. And the cool thing is, it doesn't matter even if we listen, because they're going to do things like invent Facebook or, invent Apple like Steve Jobs did when he was basically an adolescent. They're just going to do it anyway. And so the sucky thing is we oppress a lot of people who would be doing great things to change the world. But the truly dynamic ones are going to do it anyway. So I think, keep your eyes open, and especially socially, I think, being mindful of your own biases and, the times you grew up in and that sort of thing. I think we'll see social advances in the next 100 years driven by adolescents that are going to be mind-boggling. I think of, for instance, the issue of whether gay people should get married. This is a really contentious issue among people over the age of 30. But people under the age of 30 pretty much don't care. They're like, you're just people. You have to marry each other. Who cares? And I think that's the really cool thing about young people. And that's why I love young people and want to hang out with them as much as possible.
All right. Awesome. Speaking of hanging out with young people, what kind of things do you do at your camp that sort of fosters this freedom in young people?
Yeah, sure. So at the camp, we basically make it so we provide activities that we think are fun, both structured activities like a sporting game, and then kind of unstructured and imaginative play. Like one time last year, we all decided we were going to go to the other side of the lake and just, pretend we were native people to the camp and, kind of harass people in boats as they came by, just immersing ourselves in that sort of imagination. But basically, we just take cues from the kids. It's all about what they like. Each kid is asked every single day, how do they like the things they did? What do they want to do? What do they want to do more of? No kid is ever told, hey, you're enjoying this, you better stop. And because that's the factory line approach to school, which is puzzling, obviously. Like a kid is excited about learning about English and then has to stop to go learn about science. Makes no sense. So basically, kids are allowed to immerse themselves. If that means missing swimming, it means missing swimming. Essentially, as long as we can supervise the children, they're free to do mostly what they want, so long as it's not going to cause them any physical harm or anyone else harm, or really go against the wishes of their parents. We definitely don't want to take that control away from the parents when they come. The parents are as much a client as the kid, and so it's just trying to have fun and throughout each activity, staying involved in building the kids up as people, telling them that we love them for exactly who they are, for the virtuous things they're doing, not valuing them based on who's fastest or smartest or things that they have absolutely no control over, empowering them to have a growth mindset with themselves, which is, teaching them they can be anything they want to be, I guess. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. It really does seem to me to serve as a magic wand. When kids are being treated nicely, that's enough of a change. Like the bar is set so low for them everywhere else in their life that makes them have a great time. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Excellent. And so mostly what we've been talking about is public education, compulsory education. We've talked about young kids, teenagers. But what about college? The government obviously influences higher learning to an extreme degree, both with the subsidies they provide, which bump costs up tremendously, and with the way the curriculum works. How do you feel about the way our higher education system is right now in this country?
Well, I think it's horrible for obvious reasons, but to elaborate on the reasons, I think the biggest issue is that it's just seen as the 13th grade, which is more a social issue, and it comes from parents like sending their kids off to school who are not interested in learning stuff. When I was in college, I was not interested in learning the stuff that was being taught there for the most part, and that is a big problem. I learned a lot of cool things, especially about living on my own and interacting with people and, through the various organizations I was involved in. And I learned some stuff too. But I think the biggest thing is if we just moved our culture towards college being a thing you pursued, if you had some sort of technical thing you wanted to learn, like if you want to be a doctor, makes sense to learn from authorities. One of the movements I'm really excited about is the uncollege movement, which is, I guess, kind of spearheaded by this guy named Dale Stevens, I think, who it's just uncollegeithink.com, but he's basically telling people, don't go to school if that's not what you want to do. You can learn things in other places. You can be employed without a college diploma. And he does research, actually. He's a 20-year-old kid. He's an absolutely fascinating guy. But he does research into the opportunity cost of college. Is it worth your time to be $100,000 in debt and have no work experience? And his conclusion is no, but I invite everyone to make that choice for themselves, for sure.
Personally, I acquired a little bit of debt myself and spent 4 years, and I figured, I could have maybe done a little bit better if I would have spent those 4 years working. But of course, what we're told in high school is, that's what everybody's pushing you towards. Oh, you got good grades? You're great. You're going to go to a great college and get a great job. They don't really tell you, hey, you're going to come out of college and have a lot of debt and basically be starting from ground zero as far as getting a job. The degree does help you in a sense, but in essence, it's really nothing more than a piece of paper. Oh,
yeah. Well, and that's, what Dale's research has definitely shown. I think his numbers are something that like 24% of kids under the age of 25, from like 21 to 25, are functionally unemployed, and another 50% on top of that are working jobs that don't require a college diploma. Those are raw numbers. You can check out his Uncollege site for better details, but it did used to be the case. 50 years ago, a college degree was a pension. It was a check for life. And it's just not it anymore. It's academic inflation. And for me personally, as someone who hires people, I definitely don't care about a college diploma. And my hope is that as people of our generation get into positions of power, that it becomes less important. Certainly, I'm not going to pressure my son to go to college. But it is a reality that for a lot of jobs, they say require a bachelor's degree. So, that doesn't mean you can't go and get one from like the University of Phoenix, but you probably do need one for a lot of different career pursuits. Right. Although sometimes now you'll see in job descriptions or equivalent experience. Yes, which good point. Is an important step in the right direction, I think. Oh, no doubt. And I think if I get a resume that has some sort of exceptional experience, I'm certainly going to look past education because I'm reasonable, and I think certainly the big players that are good businesses like Google and Facebook or wherever else are going to think the same thing. Like if you've, like the kid who made Napster or whatever, like I don't think the first thing he writes is his college diploma. I think he probably writes, hey, I actually did something. Yeah. So. All right. Well, any intriguing thoughts for the future? Anything you're really excited about right now? No, I think the thing I'm most excited about is just people taking more ownership and intentional approach to interacting with their kids. I see so many positive signs of people moving out of the dark ages. And I really hope that it's not like in the 60s where there was a huge homeschooling movement that was generally, just squashed by a public relations campaign from the government. I really hope that doesn't happen this time around. I hope people are willing to not make excuses as far as what their priorities are. If you think public school is great, send your kids to public school, that's cool. But I just encourage people not to make excuses in any part of their lives. This is something that held me back from changing my life for several years. And I even had a pretty decent life. But there's always an excuse not to do something, But if you want to be happy, you need to be the change you want to see in the world, And I think that schooling's no different. And I also want to end it on saying anyone can do this. You do not need to have my educational background or be a teacher like my wife, with Khan Academy, with resources available online. It really is just a matter of going to your child and saying, do you want to try this? He says yes. I promise that you'll be able to do it. And if you have trouble, find me on libertychildren.com and I will personally help you with it. That's a promise, because I really do believe in this stuff. So that's pretty much it.
Excellent. Well, that's a great note to end it on. Anything else you'd like to say, James?
Not much, man. Keep up all the awesome work with the Freedom Fiends. I'm a big believer now, and listening every day. I'm going to listen to you guys on the way home from where I am now. So I appreciate all the hard work you guys are doing for advancing liberty on your end.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great day, and keep up the good fight.
Yeah, right on, man.
Thanks.
I'll hope to talk to you soon.
Hello, Freedom Fiends. It's your boy me from the U.S. Get the U.S. out my bloodstream. I own me and that includes endorphins. No one won't ask permission and I won't say please. Freedom fans, one fact that I gotta make clear is
The Freedom Fiends podcast is covered by a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 3.0 license. Do what you want with it and spread it around. Tell 2 friends. Make copies. Email it to everyone you know. Go on the site and comment. This is a conversation. Every week, we'll have an exciting new episode where Michael W. Dean and Neema Vedadi weave their own unique take on the way the world works and how to find your place in it. Available from freedomfeens.com. That's FREEDOMFEENS.com.
Freedom Fiends is proudly syndicated by Alterati.com, the Micro Effect Radio Network at themicroeffect.com, and the Liberty Radio Network at LRN.FM.
Subscribe and tell 2 friends.
And remember, the only